Elena Petrov crouched behind the crumbling concrete wall, her breathing steady despite the chaos erupting around her. The abandoned factory on the outskirts of Sarajevo had become her fortress, though she knew it might also become her tomb. Through the scope of her modified Dragunov rifle, she watched enemy soldiers positioning themselves across the industrial complex. 23 armed men had surrounded her position, believing they had trapped a single rebel fighter. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Born in a small village near the Russian border, Elena had learned to hunt before she could properly ride a bicycle. Her grandfather, a veteran marksman from the Great War, had taught her that patience was more valuable than ammunition. Every shot must count, he would say, because in real combat, you rarely get a second chance to make the same mistake. The conflict had started 3 months earlier when government forces began their brutal campaign against her region. Elena had watched her neighbors disappear in the night, seen families torn apart by soldiers who followed orders without question. When they came for her younger brother Dmitri, something inside her snapped. The quiet schoolteacher who spent her evenings reading poetry became something else entirely. Now, as bullets whistled overhead and shattered the remaining windows of the factory, Elena assessed her situation with cold precision. Her rifle held 10 rounds, and she carried 2 additional magazines. 30 shots to eliminate 23 enemies who had automatic weapons, grenades, and overwhelming firepower advantage. The mathematics seemed impossible, but Elena had learned that wars were not won by mathematics alone. She had chosen this factory specifically because she knew every inch of its layout. During her childhood, her uncle had worked here, and she had spent countless summer days exploring the maze of machinery, conveyor belts, and storage rooms. Knowledge of terrain was her greatest weapon, more valuable than any rifle or scope. The enemy commander was positioning his men in a wide circle, planning to close in from all directions simultaneously. Elena could see him through her scope, a tall man with a distinctive scar across his left cheek barking orders and pointing at different sections of the building. He wore the insignia of a major, and his confident movements suggested this was not his first siege operation. Elena steadied her rifle against a steel beam and took her first shot. The bullet traveled 340 meters and struck the enemy communications officer who was setting up a radio antenna. The man dropped instantly, his equipment scattering across the concrete. Immediately, the other soldiers began searching for the source of the shot, their movements becoming more cautious and scattered. She had fired from the 3rd floor of the factory, but Elena was already moving to a different position before the echo of her gunshot faded. Using a rope she had rigged earlier, she descended to the 2nd floor and crawled through a maintenance tunnel that led to the opposite side of the building. Her grandfather had taught her that a sniper who stayed in one location was a dead sniper. Through a different window, Elena observed the enemy soldiers communicating through hand signals now that their radio operator was down. The major was clearly frustrated, pointing angrily at the building and dividing his men into smaller search groups. This was exactly what Elena had hoped for. Divided forces were vulnerable forces. Her second shot came 8 minutes later from the ground floor, targeting a soldier who had separated from his squad to investigate the loading dock. The bullet struck him in the chest and he collapsed behind a concrete barrier. His companions immediately took cover, but they were now looking in the wrong direction, focused on the ground level while Elena was already climbing back to the upper floors. The psychological effect was exactly what she intended. The enemy soldiers were beginning to realize they were not hunting a trapped animal, but rather being hunted themselves by someone who knew these grounds far better than they did. Their advance slowed considerably as each man became more concerned with his own survival than with completing the mission. Elena reached her 3rd position and observed through her scope as the major gathered his remaining men for a hasty conference. She could read lips well enough to understand they were discussing retreat, but the major was insisting they complete their objective. He pointed directly at the factory and made it clear that failure was not an option. She adjusted her scope for wind and distance, then took her 3rd shot. The bullet struck the major in the shoulder, spinning him around but not killing him instantly. Elena had aimed for a wound rather than a kill shot, knowing that an injured commander would create more chaos than a dead one. The major's men immediately rushed to help him, clustering together in exactly the formation Elena had anticipated. From her elevated position, She could see everything unfolding according to the tactical principles her grandfather had drilled into her: create confusion, divide the enemy, force them to make emotional rather than strategic decisions. She was not just shooting targets. She was conducting a symphony of psychological warfare. As darkness began to fall across the industrial complex, Elena prepared for the most dangerous phase of her defense. The enemy would likely attempt a coordinated assault under cover of darkness, believing the reduced visibility would work in their favor. They did not know that Elena had spent the previous week studying the patrol patterns of the security lights, memorizing exactly which areas would be illuminated and which would remain in shadow. She chambered another round and settled into position for what would be the longest night of her life. 20 enemies remained, and she had 27 bullets left. The odds were still against her, but Elena Petrov had never been one to surrender when the mathematics looked unfavorable. Her grandfather had taught her that wars were won by determination, precision, and the willingness to do what others considered impossible. The factory's emergency lighting system cast long shadows across the concrete floors as Elena moved through the darkness like a ghost. She had disabled the main power grid an hour before sunset, leaving only the battery-powered emergency lights that created perfect pools of visibility surrounded by impenetrable darkness. Every step was calculated, every movement silent as she navigated through the industrial maze she knew by heart. Through her night vision scope, Elena watched the enemy soldiers struggling to adapt to the changed conditions. They had flashlights and tactical lights on their weapons, but these only served to announce their positions while blinding them to anything beyond their narrow beams. The major, despite his wounded shoulder, continued to coordinate his men through whispered commands and hand signals. Elena had positioned herself in the factory's old control room on the second floor, a reinforced concrete structure that provided excellent sight lines while offering protection from multiple directions. The room's windows had been shot out years earlier, leaving perfect firing ports that were nearly invisible from ground level. Her fourth shot eliminated a soldier who was attempting to reach the factory's rear entrance. The man had been moving carefully from cover to cover, but Elena had anticipated his route and waited patiently for him to cross the 15-meter gap between two concrete pillars. The bullet struck him center mass and he dropped without a sound. The remaining soldiers immediately went to ground, pressing themselves against whatever cover they could find. Elena observed through her scope as fear began to replace their initial confidence. They were trained fighters, but this situation was unlike anything in their manuals. They were being systematically eliminated by an invisible enemy who seemed to anticipate their every move. She changed positions again, using a series of maintenance catwalks to reach the factory's old administrative offices. The major had begun rotating his men in pairs, never allowing anyone to remain stationary for more than a few minutes. It was a sound tactical decision, but it also meant his forces were constantly in motion, making them vulnerable during transitions between cover positions. Elena's fifth shot targeted one half of a two-man team as they attempted to advance along the factory's eastern wall. The soldier's partner immediately returned fire in her general direction, but his muzzle flashes only revealed his position, while Elena remained hidden in the darkness above. She noted his location but did not return fire immediately, preferring to let uncertainty and paranoia work on the enemy's nerves. The psychological warfare was proving as effective as her marksmanship. Elena could hear urgent whispered conversations among the remaining soldiers, arguments about whether to retreat or call for reinforcements. The major's voice carried clearly in the still night air as he ordered his men to maintain their positions, but Elena could hear the strain in his tone. His shoulder wound was affecting his ability to command effectively. 20 minutes passed without Elena firing another shot. She moved through the factory's upper levels, observing and waiting. Below her, the enemy soldiers grew increasingly nervous as they strained to detect any sign of movement. Several times they fired at shadows or imagined targets, wasting ammunition and revealing their positions. Elena's sixth shot came from an unexpected angle, fired through a hole in the factory's roof that she had discovered during her earlier reconnaissance. The bullet struck a soldier who had positioned himself behind what he believed was secure cover near the loading bay. The shot seemed to come from nowhere, adding to the supernatural dread that was beginning to affect the enemy's morale. Through her scope, Elena watched as 3 soldiers broke ranks and began moving toward the perimeter. clearly intending to retreat despite their orders. The major shouted commands at them, but fear had overcome military discipline. Elena let them go, understanding that soldiers who fled in panic would spread stories that might discourage future attacks on her position. The remaining fighters, now numbering only 14, pulled back to more defensive positions around the factory's main entrance. Elena realized they were planning to wait for dawn, hoping that daylight would give them the advantage they needed to locate and eliminate her. It was a reasonable strategy, but Elena had no intention of allowing them to dictate the terms of engagement. She began implementing the second phase of her defense plan. Using skills learned from her grandfather's hunting expeditions, Elena started creating false signatures to confuse and mislead her enemies. She tied strings to pieces of metal that would clank when moved by the wind, set up mirrors to reflect light in directions that suggested movement, and even used her spare clothing to create dummy positions that might draw enemy fire. Her seventh shot targeted the enemy's heavy weapons specialist, a man carrying a rocket-propelled grenade launcher that could potentially destroy her cover positions. Elena waited until he was adjusting his position, then fired a shot that struck him in the leg. Like with the major, she chose a wounding shot rather than a kill, knowing that an injured soldier requiring medical attention would tie up additional enemy resources. The factory became a maze of psychological terror as Elena continued her methodical elimination of the enemy force. She fired her eighth shot at a soldier attempting to use wire cutters on the perimeter fence, clearly planning an escape route. The bullet struck his hand, disabling him without killing him, adding another burden to the already demoralized unit. As midnight approached, Elena had reduced the enemy force from 23 to 12 effective fighters. The major was struggling to maintain unit cohesion with a combination of threats and desperate encouragement. Several of his men were questioning orders openly, something that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the engagement. Elena prepared for the most critical phase of her defense. She knew the enemy would likely attempt a final coordinated assault before dawn, throwing everything they had at the factory in one desperate push. Her ammunition was running lower, but her confidence remained steady. Every shot had found its target. Every movement had served her tactical plan. She settled into her final defensive position, a reinforced bunker-like structure built into the factory's foundation that provided excellent fields of fire in multiple directions. Here she would make her final stand, using every lesson her grandfather had taught her about patience, precision, and the deadly art of warfare. Dawn was still 3 hours away when Elena heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. Through her scope, she watched the major speaking into a handheld radio, apparently calling for aerial support. This changed the tactical situation dramatically. Her advantage of terrain and concealment would be neutralized if enemy forces could observe her position from above. Elena knew she had perhaps 20 minutes before the helicopter arrived. She had to eliminate the remaining ground forces quickly, or risk being trapped in a position where escape would be impossible. The major had made a critical error by remaining stationary while coordinating the air support request, giving Elena a clear shot at the enemy's command structure. Her ninth shot was her most important yet. She aimed carefully at the major's radio, not at the man himself. The bullet destroyed the communication device in a shower of sparks and fragments, cutting off his connection with the approaching aircraft. The major dove for cover, clutching his wounded shoulder and shouting orders that his men could barely hear over the wind whistling through the factory's broken windows. Without radio coordination, the helicopter would have to search for the factory visually, buying Elena precious time to complete her mission. She moved quickly through the predetermined route she had memorized, reaching a position that gave her line of sight to the enemy's reorganized defensive positions. The remaining soldiers had clustered around the main entrance, using concrete barriers and overturned vehicles as cover. They were clearly planning to rush the building simultaneously, hoping to overwhelm Elena through sheer numbers. It was their best remaining strategy, but Elena had anticipated this exact scenario. Her 10th shot targeted the soldier carrying the squad's ammunition supply. The man was positioned behind the others, distributing extra magazines and grenades to his comrades. Elena's bullet struck the ammunition bag he was carrying, causing several grenades to spill onto the concrete. The explosion that followed was not from her gunshot, but from the soldiers' panicked reaction as they scrambled away from the potentially dangerous ordnance. In the chaos that followed, Elena fired 3 rapid shots in succession. Her 11th, 12th, and 13th bullets each found their targets as enemy soldiers broke cover to escape the scattered explosives. She had learned from her grandfather that sometimes the best moment to strike was when the enemy was focused on a different threat entirely. The helicopter's rotors were growing louder, and Elena could see its searchlight beginning to sweep across the industrial complex. She had perhaps 5 minutes before it would locate the factory and provide aerial reconnaissance to the remaining ground forces. The tactical situation was reaching a critical point where her options would become severely limited. Elena made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation. Instead of seeking deeper cover within the factory, she moved toward the roof access ladder. If the helicopter was going to change the rules of engagement, she would adapt accordingly. Her grandfather had taught her that flexibility was the mark of a truly superior tactician. The factory's roof provided an unexpected tactical advantage. Elena could see the helicopter approaching from the northeast, its searchlight probing the darkness systematically. More importantly, she could observe the remaining enemy soldiers positioned around the building's perimeter. From this elevation, their cover positions looked far less secure than they appeared from ground level. Her 14th shot eliminated the enemy's lookout, a soldier positioned with binoculars who was directing the movement of his comrades through hand signals. Without his coordination, the remaining fighters lost much of their tactical cohesion. Elena watched through her scope as confusion spread among their ranks. The helicopter was now directly overhead, its downwash creating swirling clouds of dust and debris that actually worked to Elena's advantage by obscuring visibility. The pilot was clearly having difficulty maintaining a steady hover in the turbulent air created by the factory's tall smokestacks and irregular roof structures. Elena's 15th shot was fired at an angle she would never have believed possible 6 months earlier. The bullet arced upward through the helicopter's rotor wash and struck the aircraft's external fuel tank, not to destroy it, but to create a visible fuel leak that the pilot would be forced to address immediately. The helicopter banked sharply and began heading for a safe landing area, removing the aerial threat from the equation. With the helicopter gone, Elena had eliminated the enemy's most significant advantage. The remaining 7 soldiers were now trapped in positions they had chosen for defense against ground-level threats, not for protection from an elevated sniper who could observe their every movement. She fired her 16th and 17th shots in rapid succession, targeting 2 soldiers who attempted to retreat from their exposed positions. Both bullets found their marks, and the remaining 5 fighters pressed themselves deeper into whatever cover they could find. Elena could hear them calling out to each other, trying to coordinate a response, but their voices carried panic rather than confidence. The major, despite his wounded shoulder, was still attempting to maintain command of his deteriorating unit. Elena watched through her scope as he crawled from position to position, trying to encourage his men and organize some form of counterattack. His dedication was admirable, but it also made him predictable. Elena's 18th shot was aimed not at the major himself, but at the concrete directly in front of his position. The bullet fragmented on impact, sending concrete chips and metal fragments in all directions. The major was not seriously injured, but the psychological impact was devastating. Even their leader was not safe from the invisible sniper, who seemed to control every aspect of the battlefield. As the first pale light of dawn began to appear on the horizon, Elena prepared for the final phase of her defense. 5 enemy soldiers remained, plus the wounded major who was more liability than asset to his remaining forces. Her rifle held 7 more bullets, giving her adequate ammunition to complete the engagement if her accuracy remained consistent. The remaining soldiers were clearly debating whether to attempt one final assault or to retreat entirely. Elena could hear fragments of their whispered conversation, words like impossible and supernatural, mixed with more colorful expressions of fear and frustration. She had successfully transformed a simple military operation into a nightmare scenario that would haunt these survivors for the rest of their lives. She settled into position for the final elimination of the enemy force, knowing that sunrise would bring new challenges, but confident that her grandfather's lessons had prepared her for whatever came next. The first rays of sunlight streaming through the factory's broken skylights revealed the true extent of Elena's tactical masterpiece. Bodies and wounded soldiers were scattered across the industrial complex in a pattern that told the story of a perfectly executed defensive operation. The remaining 5 enemy soldiers huddled behind inadequate cover, their faces showing the strain of a night spent in constant terror. Elena observed their positions through her scope, noting how exhaustion and fear had affected their tactical awareness. These were not the same confident fighters who had surrounded the factory 12 hours earlier. They moved with the hesitant, paranoid behavior of men who had learned to fear shadows and silence more than gunfire and explosions. The major was still alive, but clearly struggling with blood loss from his shoulder wound. Elena could see him attempting to field dress the injury with trembling hands, while trying to maintain visual contact with his remaining men. His military bearing remained intact, but his effectiveness as a combat leader had been systematically destroyed throughout the night. Elena's 19th shot targeted the enemy's radio operator, a replacement who had taken over communications duties after the original operator was eliminated in her first shot. The bullet struck the man's radio antenna, destroying their last reliable means of calling for reinforcements or coordinating with outside units. The psychological impact was immediate and visible, as the remaining soldiers realized they were truly isolated. Through her scope, Elena watched the enemy fighters beginning to crack under the pressure. 2 soldiers were arguing in harsh whispers about whether to attempt an escape, while a third was methodically checking and rechecking his weapon with the obsessive behavior of a man approaching psychological breakdown. The major tried to restore order, but his weakened condition and the obvious hopelessness of their situation undermined his authority. Elena's grandfather had taught her that victory in combat was often achieved not through killing every enemy, but through breaking their will to fight. She had successfully transformed a superior force into a collection of frightened individuals whose only concern was personal survival. This was psychological warfare at its most effective level. Her 20th shot eliminated a soldier who had begun moving toward the perimeter fence, clearly intending to desert his unit. Elena's bullet struck him in the leg, disabling rather than killing him. The wounded man's screams for medical attention added another layer of psychological pressure on his remaining comrades, who now had to choose between helping him and maintaining their defensive positions. The major made a critical decision that revealed his desperation. He ordered his remaining 3 effective soldiers to abandon their positions and attempt a coordinated rush on the factory's main entrance. It was a suicide mission disguised as tactics, but the men were so demoralized that they obeyed without question. Elena prepared for the final confrontation of the engagement. As the 3 soldiers began their desperate charge across the open ground, Elena fired her 21st, 22nd, and 23rd shots in rapid succession. Each bullet found its target with the precision that had characterized her entire defensive operation. The soldiers dropped within meters of each other, their assault ending before it truly began. The major was now alone among the dead and wounded members of his unit. Elena could see him through her scope, sitting with his back against a concrete barrier, staring at the factory building with the expression of a man who had witnessed something beyond his understanding. His rifle lay beside him, forgotten and unused. Elena emerged from the factory's main entrance, her rifle held at the ready but pointed skyward. She walked slowly across the debris-strewn courtyard toward the major's position, her footsteps echoing in the morning silence. The sound of her approach seemed to break the major from his trance, and he looked up at her with a mixture of fear and professional admiration. She stopped approximately 10 meters from his position, close enough to speak without shouting, but far enough to react if he attempted any desperate action. The major made no move toward his weapon, instead raising his uninjured hand in a gesture that might have been surrender or simple acknowledgement of her superior tactical skills. 23 men, Elena said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. You brought 23 soldiers to capture 1 schoolteacher. The major's response was barely above a whisper. What are you? Elena considered the question seriously before answering. I am someone who learned from my grandfather that wars are not won by superior numbers or better equipment. They are won by understanding the terrain, understanding your enemy, and never giving up when the cause is just. She kept her rifle ready while studying the major's condition. His shoulder wound needed medical attention, but it was not immediately life-threatening. More importantly, his eyes showed the hollow look of a man whose worldview had been fundamentally shattered. He would never again underestimate an opponent based on appearance or numbers. Your helicopter pilot will return with reinforcements, Elena observed. You should use your remaining time to tend to your wounded and prepare for evacuation. This engagement is over. The major nodded slowly, his military training finally overcoming his shock. The wounded soldier by the fence, he said, pointing toward one of his men who had been hit in the leg. He needs immediate medical attention. Elena appreciated that the major's first concern was for his men rather than for his own situation. It spoke well of his character, despite the circumstances that had brought them into conflict. She gestured toward the factory's medical station, a first aid facility that had been maintained even after the factory closed. There are medical supplies in the building, she told him. Clean bandages, antiseptic, pain medication, enough to stabilize your wounded until help arrives. The major struggled to his feet, favoring his injured shoulder. I have to ask, he said, meeting Elena's eyes directly. How did you know? How did you anticipate every move we made? Elena considered her response carefully. My grandfather taught me that every battlefield tells a story to those who know how to read it. You brought soldiers trained to fight other soldiers in open combat. I defended my home using knowledge passed down through generations of hunters and survivors. The advantage was always mine, not yours. As the sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, Elena stepped back toward the factory entrance. The engagement was over, but her war was far from finished. There would be other battles, other enemies who underestimated the determination of people fighting for their homeland and freedom. She disappeared into the factory's shadows just as the rescue helicopters appeared over the ridge, leaving the major to explain to his superiors how a single defender had eliminated an entire assault unit through superior tactics and unshakable resolve. 3 weeks after the factory engagement, Elena Petrov had become a legend whispered about in enemy camps and celebrated in villages throughout the resistance territory. The story of the schoolteacher who eliminated an entire military unit had spread far beyond its original battlefield, inspiring other defenders and striking fear into the hearts of enemy commanders who now questioned every seemingly routine operation. Elena herself remained focused on the practical aspects of warfare rather than her growing reputation. She had relocated to a series of safe houses in the mountains, establishing a network of observation posts and supply caches that would allow her to operate independently for extended periods. Her grandfather's lessons about preparation and patience had proven more valuable than any formal military training. The enemy's response to the factory incident had been swift and comprehensive. They increased patrol sizes, improved communication protocols, and began using different tactical approaches that showed they were taking the sniper threat seriously. Elena studied these changes carefully, adapting her own methods to counter their evolving strategies. Her new operational area centered around a critical supply route that enemy forces used to transport weapons and reinforcements to the front lines. The mountain highway offered numerous natural sniper positions with excellent sight lines and multiple escape routes. Elena spent days studying traffic patterns, noting vehicle types, timing of convoys, and security procedures. The first convoy she engaged consisted of 3 armored trucks carrying ammunition supplies. Elena positioned herself on a rocky outcrop 800 meters from the road, using the morning mist to conceal her muzzle flash. Her first shot targeted the lead vehicle's driver, causing the truck to veer off the road and block traffic for the following vehicles. Instead of immediately engaging the other vehicles, Elena waited and observed. Soldiers emerged from the trucks to investigate the incident, establishing a defensive perimeter while their commander assessed the situation. Elena counted 12 fighters, all carrying automatic weapons and wearing body armor that would require precise shot placement. Her grandfather had taught her that patience was often more valuable than speed in combat situations. Elena waited for 47 minutes, watching through her scope as the enemy soldiers gradually relaxed their vigilance. Human nature worked against military discipline as the men began assuming. The first shot had been fired by an opportunistic sniper who had already fled the area. Elena's second shot eliminated the convoy commander who was standing beside his vehicle while coordinating recovery operations on his radio. The bullet struck him in the head, killing him instantly and creating immediate chaos among his men. Without clear leadership, the soldiers began making emotional rather than tactical decisions. The psychological impact was even greater than at the factory. These soldiers had heard stories about the female sniper who could appear anywhere and eliminate entire units. When their commander dropped without warning, Several men immediately assumed they were facing the same supernatural threat that had destroyed the factory assault team. Elena fired her third and fourth shots in rapid succession, targeting two soldiers who were attempting to establish radio communication with their headquarters. The loss of communication capability added to the unit's panic, as they realized they were cut off from support and facing an unknown number of enemies. Rather than continuing the direct engagement, Elena implemented a new tactical approach she had been developing. She fired several shots at the disabled vehicle's fuel tanks, not to cause explosions but to create fuel leaks that would prevent the convoy from completing its mission, even if the soldiers managed to escape. The remaining soldiers attempted to organize a counterattack, spreading out along the roadway to search for Elena's position. However, their movement pattern showed they were expecting to engage multiple enemies rather than a single sniper. Elena used this misconception to her advantage, firing from different positions to create the impression of a coordinated ambush. Her fifth shot targeted a soldier who was moving too confidently across open ground, apparently believing he was part of a flanking maneuver against multiple enemy positions. The bullet struck him in the chest, and his death cry echoed through the mountain valley with a haunting quality that affected the morale of the remaining fighters. Elena had learned that psychological warfare was often more effective than direct confrontation. She began using techniques designed to maximize fear and confusion, rather than simply eliminating targets. Her sixth shot was aimed at a soldier's weapon rather than the man himself, disarming him without killing him, and demonstrating that she could have taken his life if she had chosen to do so. The surviving soldiers began retreating along the mountain road, abandoning their vehicles and most of their equipment. Elena allowed them to leave, understanding that frightened survivors would spread stories that would make her next engagement easier. Fear was a weapon that multiplied its effectiveness with each use. Over the following weeks, Elena conducted similar operations against 17 different convoys, developing a reputation that made enemy drivers reluctant to use the mountain route at all. Supply operations that had previously been routine became dangerous missions requiring significant security resources. The enemy adapted by increasing convoy sizes and adding armored escorts, but these changes played into Elena's strategic objectives. Larger convoys moved more slowly and were easier to track, while additional security forces meant more resources were being diverted from frontline operations to protect supply lines. Elena's grandfather had taught her that the goal of irregular warfare was not to destroy the enemy army, but to make their operations so expensive and dangerous that they would eventually abandon their objectives. She was systematically achieving this goal through careful target selection and tactical patience. Her reputation had also begun attracting other resistance fighters who wanted to learn her methods. Elena was reluctant to take on students, knowing that sniper operations required years of training and natural aptitude that could not be quickly developed. However, she began teaching basic reconnaissance and camouflage techniques to volunteers who could serve as spotters and intelligence gatherers. The war was entering a new phase, and Elena understood that her role would continue evolving as both sides adapted to changing conditions. Her grandfather's lessons remained relevant, but she was also learning to innovate and develop new techniques suited to modern battlefield realities. 6 months after the factory engagement that had transformed Elena Petrov from schoolteacher to legend, the war itself was beginning to change in ways that reflected her impact on enemy operations. Intelligence reports reaching resistance headquarters spoke of enemy commanders refusing assignments to her operational area, supply convoys requiring triple security escorts, and whole units requesting transfers rather than face deployment against the ghost of the mountains. Elena had established a network of safe houses and weapons caches throughout the region, turning the entire mountain range into her personal battlefield. Local villagers, initially fearful of the attention her presence might bring, had become active supporters once they realized the protection her reputation provided. Enemy patrols avoided areas where she might be operating, giving entire communities relief from the constant threat of raids and searches. Her operational methods had evolved far beyond simple sniper attacks. Elena now conducted sophisticated intelligence gathering operations, tracking enemy movement patterns and identifying high-value targets for elimination. She had developed a system of coded signals using mirrors and smoke that allowed friendly forces to coordinate their activities with her operations. The enemy's response had become increasingly desperate and brutal. Unable to eliminate Elena directly, they had begun targeting civilian populations in areas where she operated, hoping to turn local sentiment against her. These reprisal attacks only strengthened community support for the resistance and provided Elena with additional motivation for her continued operations. On a cold morning in late autumn, Elena received intelligence that enemy headquarters was planning a major offensive designed specifically to eliminate her threat once and for all. A full battalion of elite troops, supported by helicopter gunships and artillery, would sweep through her operational area in a coordinated operation, unlike anything previously attempted. Rather than fleeing or going into hiding, Elena decided to turn this threat into an opportunity. She began implementing a plan that would use the enemy's overwhelming force against itself, drawing them into terrain where their numerical advantage would become a liability rather than an asset. She selected an abandoned mining complex deep in the mountains, a location with multiple levels, narrow passages, and limited approaches that would force enemy forces to advance in small groups, rather than using their full strength simultaneously. Elena spent 2 weeks preparing the site, establishing firing positions, escape routes, and supply caches throughout the complex. The enemy offensive began at dawn on a Tuesday morning in November. Elena watched from her primary observation post as helicopters inserted troops at multiple locations around the mining complex, while additional forces moved up the mountain roads in armored vehicles. The operation involved over 400 soldiers, making it the largest military action the region had seen since the war began. Elena's first shot of the engagement targeted the enemy commander's radio operator, cutting off communication between the various assault groups before the operation had truly begun. Her second shot eliminated a helicopter pilot who was providing reconnaissance support, forcing the aircraft to make an emergency landing and reducing the enemy's aerial coordination capability. Rather than remaining in one position, Elena began moving through the mining complex using tunnels and shafts that she had explored and mapped during her preparation phase. The enemy forces, trained for conventional warfare, struggled to adapt to the three-dimensional battlefield that Elena had created for them. Her third and fourth shots targeted soldiers who were attempting to establish perimeter security around the mining complex, eliminating them before they could complete their defensive positions. Elena was not trying to kill every enemy soldier, but rather to create gaps in their security that would force them to redeploy and weaken their overall tactical position. The psychological impact of fighting the legendary sniper in her chosen terrain was immediately apparent. Enemy soldiers moved with extreme caution, checking and double-checking every sight line and potential hiding place. This excessive caution slowed their advance considerably and made their movements predictable to Elena's experienced eye. Over the course of 6 hours, Elena eliminated 17 enemy soldiers while constantly changing positions throughout the mining complex. The enemy forces, despite their overwhelming numbers, found themselves unable to establish effective control over any section of the battlefield. Every position they secured was immediately threatened by sniper fire from an unexpected direction. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the mountain slopes, Elena implemented the final phase of her plan. Using explosive charges she had placed in strategic locations, she began collapsing sections of the mining complex, not to trap enemy soldiers but to channel their movement into predetermined areas where her remaining ammunition would be most effective. Her final shots of the engagement were fired not at enemy soldiers but at the fuel tanks of their evacuation helicopters, ensuring that the surviving forces would have to retreat on foot through terrain that Elena controlled completely. The psychological victory was more important than the tactical one, as word spread that even a full battalion could not eliminate the ghost of the mountains. 3 years later, Elena Petrov attended the peace negotiations that ended the conflict in her region. She sat quietly in the back of the room, watching as military commanders who had once hunted her now signed documents acknowledging the independence and autonomy that she had helped secure through her individual actions. The factory where she had made her first stand had been converted into a memorial and training center where young people learned about the history of their struggle for freedom. Elena visited occasionally, always alone, remembering her grandfather's lessons about courage, patience, and the responsibility that comes with the ability to change history through individual action. She never spoke publicly about her experiences during the war, preferring to let others tell the stories that had grown into legends. Elena understood that her greatest victory had not been any single engagement, but rather the demonstration that determination and skill could overcome any odds when fighting for a just cause. The school teacher had become a symbol of resistance that would inspire future generations, proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to surrender their principles or their homeland to those who sought to destroy both.